Welcome to the Relationship Toolbox, a show about the skills we need to build healthy relationships with others. Today we're going to talk about the silent language of emotions. Why do we call it the silent language? Well, because unlike speech, our feelings cannot be seen or heard. We have to feel emotions through sensations in our body, and we usually detect these from such cues as a person's tone of voice, their body language, the way they are looking at us, even eyes and how tight they are, or lips that they're tight, that type of thing can also indicate someone's emotional state. Our brain responds to this stimuli at an extremely fast rate, and it's a chemical reaction. Some have estimated the speed of the way our brain responds to these cues at approximately 260 miles per hour, if you were to make it equivalent to the speed of a car. Because of this fast response in our brain, it's very easy to react emotionally before processing our feelings and perceptions. How many times have we heard someone say, I don't know why I did that, I just sort of blew up and I didn't think about it. Well, we're going to talk today about why that happens and what to do about it. Another problem that we find is that the average person has a very limited emotional vocabulary for some reason. In our society, we don't seem to value that as much as we do ideas. So that this is something, again, that we're going to talk about and how to improve that. So unidentified emotions are frequently the cause of conflict and misunderstanding in relationships, whether they're with a spouse, a partner, a child of yours, or even in the workplace. So being aware of emotions and being skillful in dealing with them is absolutely essential in communication. We call that skill emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
So Marsha, can you fill it? Is that IQ? What is
Well,
that?
IQ came first, but we're discovering there are all different kinds of intelligences. There's musical intelligence, there's kinesthetic intelligence, and emotional intelligence, and you mentioned the workplace. This is something that employers are looking for in terms of how you get along with a team. And this is the kind, you may know your content area, but you may not know how to work with people well as well. So it is something that people are looking for. We're not only just looking for them in our relationships, but what emotional intelligence is, it's got a couple of parts to it. One is that you can recognize what your emotion is. And in order to recognize it, we have to have names for things. So we need to be able to label or tag it, identify it, and kind of understand, oh, what is it I'm feeling? What should I name this? And what does it mean? Because we build our thoughts and our behaviors on this stimulus.
Right.
So once you have that down, then you could kind of monitor yourself and regulate that. If you recognize it and you can name it and you know, you can predict almost, that's part of it. So identify it, monitor it, and then when you are kind of agile with that, you can begin to recognize similar things in other people. And you can maybe change your behavior in order to regulate it or calibrate it with the situation.
It's definitely a two-way process,
It
isn't
is.
it? Yeah.
But we can just kind of muddle through if we're not thinking about it deliberately and we don't have an emotional intelligence. Then we kind of repeat these blind exchanges. So how does the brain generate emotions?
This is very interesting to me to look into this, and then not that I'm an expert on the brain. And you'll see, I believe, a slide that we're going to have to show that the brain, in terms of what we're talking about now in a simplified way, could be thought of as having three layers, sort of one on top of the other. And each layer has sort of a different function. So the bottom layer, the one at the very bottom, is the brain stem. And that has sort of the automatic functions. It's a very primitive part of our, some people
The oldest part,
yeah,
right?
some people even call it the reptilian part of the brain, because in terms of evolution, it was the beginning.
But it got us here.
It got us
It
here,
helped
yes.
us survive
Exactly.
to get here, yeah.
So that's the bottom part of the brain. The midsection is referred to as the limbic system, and you can see that on the diagram. And it is unique to mammals. So, and it deals with emotions. There's one part of it, there are actually 3 organs within that. The hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the amygdala.
Okay.
And it's the amygdala that we're going to be concentrating on today.
Okay.
Because that one has the most impact on this sudden blowing up,
Like reactive
thing. It's designed to do that. So the amygdala actually senses danger, a threat. In prehistoric days, probably the threat was maybe a dangerous animal or maybe another tribe coming in.
A threat to survival.
A threat to survival, yes. And now, unfortunately, that part of the brain is still there,
Well,
still reading threats, but the threat could be to our ego.
Right.
The threat could be to just a statement that was said about us that didn't go well.
It's probably still fortunate that it's there and that it's incorporated.
It's needed for
because-
safety, definitely,
yeah, for safety,
yes.
yeah.
But unfortunately, it reacts beyond just safety, and that's where we get into some trouble with it. So the problem with the amygdala is it has a very limited response. So the response, it'll give you 3 different responses to something out of danger: to fight, to run away or flee, to freeze, or to appease. So, and that's it. That's as much as it
So
can
there are
do.
even maybe 4, I'm thinking.
Right,
because-
4,
yeah.
yes, I'm sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
four different functions there. And another property of this particular amygdala is that when it is fired and sending out signals, it completely overrides the higher level of our brain, the neocortex, which we're going to get into.
Okay.
So that is absolutely shut down.
It eclipses everything else.
Exactly.
Awesome.
It just floods the brain so that, and we wonder why people act in such a weird way. Say, what that person did was just totally
Irrational.
different. Yes,
And it is irrational because the reasoning part of our brain is eclipsed.
there.
It's not. It's
exactly.
It's been bypassed.
So
yeah.
the reasoning part is the cerebral cortex, and it is the most recent evolution of the brain. It's the largest section, and it controls solving complex problems, achieving goals, developing verbal skills, which we're going to be interested in talking about, and making decisions based on facts and reality rather than on just an emotional reaction. So here's where some of the skills we're going to be talking about. This part of the brain, the cerebral cortex, has to be functioning for these skills to be working.
Happening, yeah.
Otherwise, the part of the brain that can do that is shut down. So another thing that I thought was very interesting is in addition to the amygdala being a portion of the brain that is very sensitive to threats, the cerebral cortex is very sensitive to perception of trust.
Really? Okay.
So it's a different part of the brain. And when that is firing, then that's when we get that sensation of closeness to someone and a sense of goodwill with it. And obviously we can interact and our relationship then can really thrive. So the important points that we're trying to make in this, rather than, we're not trying to do an anatomy lesson here, but that there are different parts of the brain that govern different emotions, and that the amygdala, if we're not careful, the amygdala can actually hijack every other circuit in the brain and can really do a job on relationships. So it does that by flooding the brain with cortisol, and it shuts it down. We just talked about the 4 different responses that it can give. So the reasoning, as we just mentioned, totally unavailable. And we wonder why when people get that agitated, sometimes someone will try to say, think, do
Right,
this.
and you just can't.
It's not available to them.
Yeah, so if this is happening to us, this might be, or it happens to us on behalf of somebody else, this is when you feel like you have to go back and apologize because something just overtook you, or the other person shows up and says, you know, I don't know what came over me.
Right.
And it may even be true, because if you don't know how to regulate yourself, and it has to almost be a physical regulation,
Yes,
because it's a
it is
physical
one,
process
yeah.
that's happening to you. So we've got emotions, but then we have like the thoughts that we build on those things too, because we are reacting to a stimulus, but then we think about it too, and that will also inform our behavior. So if we think about emotions or feelings, it's often like a physical thing. We may feel it in our body, but the thoughts that we have are going to be more heady. They're going to be
very
more
much in our head,
like,
yes.
It's more, and we're trying to evaluate and make sense of it. We're trying to build meaning out of what's happening. So that's why we create these thoughts and make assumptions and then act on it.
Right. And unfortunately, in our society, it seems as if we've put a much higher value on the thoughts rather than on the emotions. In fact, the emotions sometimes have been diminished by just saying, you know, don't get emotional about this.
Right.
When the emotions can actually be helpful.
And while the emotions are real and valid and visceral, and they just are, sometimes the thoughts, they're made up about situations and assumptions that we haven't tested.
Yes.
And they may be they're fabricated. It's because we try to make sense. And the way you could know the difference between the two is if you're trying to express the emotion, it can usually just be one word, like sad, mad, frustrated. Whereas if you're thinking about a thought about that emotion, it usually takes words to describe it, multiple words.
A typical giveaway is when someone says, well, I feel like.
Feel like, yeah.
As soon as they put the word like in there, they're going to give you a
You're
thought.
talking about the layer of their evaluation rather than what they're actually feeling.
Yes.
So, you know, all right, so sometimes people say, well, you're too emotional. Why are emotions important?
Well, we're going back to the title of our show, The Silent Language. Some people have estimated that 90% of our communication is nonverbal. And that's a lot of communication that's going without words. So in that regard, I would think that would put emotions right up there in terms of significance.
Yeah. And yet, it's important for us to convey these strong feelings to really communicate what's going on. Because effective relationships are more than just trading information back and forth. We need to understand how we can communicate this internal reaction that is often physical to the people in our lives, so they know how to interact with us.
Sure. I think of an example of that where someone might be in a workplace giving a presentation on something, and they might have all kinds of facts and figures and so forth to display, but if their whole affect, their emotional thing is just sort of flat and unenthusiastic about it, what's going to be the reaction of the people listening to this, especially if they're in competition with another company that's offering something?
So we can kind of infer things from tone or from pace or from the volume or from body language.
Right.
But it would be helpful if we knew how to describe our emotions too, though. And I think that that isn't something that we do really well. And because we don't have the language. We don't build languages around emotions. In fact, I think that you were saying that there was a study that said that the descriptions that came up were happy, sad, mad, or happy, sad, angry. Well, those are big stroke emotions, but there are lots of subsets of those. And if that's all you know, and if that's all you can describe, it's vague. It's kind of like throwing a dart at a dartboard and it's going anywhere. You don't really you are not targeting it. And in order to remedy whatever feelings you're having about your emotion, if you can't define it, then you don't know how to fix it.
Or you may get the wrong remedy.
You may get the wrong remedy. It may be confusing for the people around you if you're
Yes.
saying it's one thing when it's really another, and you don't grow. You just repeat this because it's kind of this vague experience that you had that you can't describe. It's nebulous, and the next time it happens, it'll maybe be the same because you haven't been able to really define it well.
Right.
So language around this, to build some words and to really kind of break it down into the different pieces is important.
If someone can't read your emotions, they're less likely to trust you. And it goes the other way too. If you're not good at expressing emotions, then someone could not trust you. So it's a major factor in communication to be able to share that.
I think that I remember seeing that in really young children, and sometimes they resorted to physical expressions because they lacked the vocabulary.
Yes.
I remember, there was a kid in the neighborhood who, threw a rock at one point just because he wanted his playmate to give him space and to go away, but he couldn't express that. And I think very young children sometimes bite, just as a way to express themselves when they don't have the language.
Right.
But you would expect more of us as adults, but if all we have is happy, sad, mad,
It's not going to work.
it's not a whole lot better than, we need to kind of transcend that simplicity of it.
Right. Yeah.
In terms of how we socialize and how we care for each other. But I think doing that self-reflection is important to do that first before we can explain it and before we can recognize it.
Yeah. How often have we heard adults say to a child, use your words, and when the child is flailing and acting out and so forth, well, that's a nice advice, but you have to have the words to use.
Right.
So if you don't, it's just more frustrating.
And we don't cultivate them, I don't think, because emotions are, they're gender related in some cases, or they are not recognized as being useful or important, or something that we need to suppress entirely.
Right.
How do emotions and thoughts and behavior interact with each other?
Okay, I think we have another diagram on this one. So the first thing that happens is what we've been describing. If you could look at the diagram there in the upper left-hand corner, these are actually, looks like two snowmen, but they represent two people. One person on the left, one on the right. So when we look at that diagram, the person on the left, we're going to start with that person. That person will observe something or hear something that triggers a strong emotion. And again, as we talked about, it happens in a millisecond. It's just so fast. It has to be a fairly strong emotion because if we responded to everything this way, we would be so exhausted.
Right, and in this case, we are interchanging the words emotion and feeling, even though, academics may splice those. So in our diagram, feeling would be the emotion.
Emotion, yes, okay. Then the brain, as we talked about, makes a judgment call very quickly as to whether this stimulus that's coming through is threatening or supportive. And some have even said, trying not to use miles per hour, but that it's 7/100th of a second that it occurs in. So again, it's a very fast process. And so the judgment basically for the brain is this fear, something I need to protect us from, or is it something I can trust? Next, we create a thought, I think you mentioned that attempts to explain our feeling and to give it some meaning. So that's where the vocabulary comes in, because we can begin to say, oh, I'm really feeling resentful, or instead of just angry with it. It helps to define that. Then we begin to act on our emotions. We turn it into a behavior. So we had that initial stimulus, and then a thought about that, and then now we turn it into a behavior. which might be thrashing out. It might be another very vindictive statement to the other party, or it might be a very nice, inviting statement. That becomes the triggering event for person 2, which is at the bottom of it. And that person then goes through the same process we just described of a feeling is generated, the thought that tries to explain it, and then they turn it into an action, which again is given then to the first person again, and the cycle goes on and on.
Yeah. And we really can't, the feeling, the emotion it just is.
Right.
That's not something we could change, but if we're aware of it and can define what it is, we can maybe modulate those other things.
Right.
So some of the things we could do, there's that name to tame kind of thing that people will do. They'll say, if you can name it, you can tame it.
Yes. It's certainly a helpful thing to do.
Categorize it and just attach language to it and be as nuanced and as specific as possible so that you can really distinguish. If we have time, and I know we're running short, we'll be able to give some examples of that.
Okay.
But so how do we keep the amygdala from
the hijack?
Yeah.
It's quite a term, isn't it? Hijacking it, because that's basically what it does. Well, there are several things that could be done. The first is what you've been talking about. Pay attention, be mindful to the sensations that are going on in your body. So rather than just react with words, sense the fact that, ooh, my heart rate is going faster. Oh, I'm breathing more rapidly, more shallow. And I might even be moving my arms and legs in gestures or pointing. That's a signal that, look out, my amygdala may be taking over with it. So if you can slow down your breathing, we all know breathing exercises, breathing out, breathing in, slowing that down. And if we can time ourselves out just for a few seconds, just to take a time out. And the other thing that's so important is to stop talking. Many people, even if they try to do that, they're talking and still doing things.
Or yelling.
Yelling, yeah. So those are some things we can do.
Which then, if you're looking at that conflict cycle, that think-do, you may be triggering that in the other person.
Exactly.
In a competitive
that would be a
way.
behavior that you could intervene with. So, and keeping in mind, as we're trying to show here, that the brain is communicating at a very fast pace. And depending on which section of the brain is firing, you're going to be responding to that. So again, knowing about the amygdala, knowing that you need to respond, if it starts going there, as you indicated before, it needs to be a physical response because the amygdala is getting your body physically ready for fighting.
You counter it with breathing or with slowing down.
Right.
Physical stuff.
Physical stuff.
You're treating physical with physical.
Right. Even walking, can begin to take that out. So it used to be, we thought with batakas, if you bash people and everything, that would help to get it all out. Well, it didn't. It actually fired up the amygdala even more. So the second thing we could do is to redirect our brain into the curious mode. We've talked about that before in other sessions where you're asking, I wonder what emotion I am feeling. Is it more of this or more of that? And what we've said, you have to name it to tame it. So do I have a pattern of reacting this way? Or could I be reacting to past experiences that were similar to this, but it's not this one? So I need to differentiate that. So a third thing we can do is to recognize that the context of what this is occurring in, what is the story that I'm telling myself? That's that thought process.
Gosh. Yeah.
Because she's only doing that because she's trying to get me to do this or that. Those assumptions and those stories that we tell ourselves, they can really take us in bad directions or misinformed directions. So the other thing is, am I imposing my expectations on another person without even realizing it?
Or without communicating them.
Without communicating
sometimes
them, yes.
we have expectations that are unspoken.
Yes.
And people are supposed to just guess.
Right.
And then we're disappointed
Right.
when they are not met.
Or we get angry because
Right.
we don't know about disappointment. So that's important to understand that too. introduce your brain to another possible explanation. We've talked about this in past things about point of view. So if you can stay in that neocortex area of the brain, you can engage it and say, is there another explanation possibly for this? What is the other person's perspective on it that might have a bearing on this? So that allows us to make judgments and assessments rather than just reacting.
And I think we need to expand our self-reflection about emotions. A couple of examples are, we conflate things, like if we're conflating envy and jealousy. Those sound like synonyms, but when you really examine them, I've done some reading lately about lots of different emotions, and envy is a desire for something that you don't have that somebody else has. You're wanting something there. Whereas jealousy is you want to protect something that you already have from being lost.
Right.
It could be the love or the affection of a person, or even just their attention if they're, if they're skiing or fishing or doing something that takes them away from you. And even when we feel like completely deflated, it could be disappointment, it could be regret, you could be discouraged, you could be resigned, you could be frustrated, and it seems like all of those things, if you kind of just stir them together, it's the same thing, but they're really not.
Yes.
You could be disappointed because your expectations were not met, like we talked before, and you may not have told anybody about your expectations. You could feel regret because something turned out not the way you wanted, but you might have had some hand
role
in that,
yes.
and you feel regret and maybe a little shame.
And that would be a different intervention.
Different intervention, absolutely. Because if you're just disappointed, maybe you need to communicate. If you regret, then you need to change your interactions.
Yes.
You could be just discouraged, and you're kind of losing your confidence and your enthusiasm about something. So you could find a remedy for that. You could be resigned, like you've already lost your motivation. And that's a different remedy. You might need somebody to help you. Or you could be frustrated because something's not turning out. And that because it's not in your control. So maybe the remedy to that is to find out what you can control. But if you can't distinguish between these nuances, between jealousy and envy, between resignation and frustration, you don't know how to address it.
Right. And what a powerful tool, especially in close, intimate relationships, when you can understand, oh, that feeling means this.
And you might even be able to help a coworker or a partner by being curious and teasing it out. Well, in some of our reflective listening that we've talked about, and because it may not be easy to even identify it. Right. So you could do that.
Often that's what therapy is about.
It is. But you can do it informally as well in your circle of people.
Exactly.
Wow. There's so much more that we could say about this, but we are at the end of our time together. And so we thank you for being with us today on the Relationship Toolbox, and we will see you again soon.